On November 12, 2025 at 10:24 p.m. Washington time, President Donald Trump signed a document that ended the longest federal government shutdown in U.S. history. 43 days of political deadlock, millions of Americans without food stamps, thousands of canceled flights, and more than 1 million federal employees working without pay, all ended with the stroke of a pen. But the price of this political game was unprecedented. From closed national parks to empty food assistance cards, here is a timeline and the consequences of the shutdown that changed Americans' perception of how expensive political struggles in Washington can be. The economic consequences of the 43-day shutdown were so severe that it is difficult to describe them in mere numbers. According to estimates by the Anderson Economic Group, the direct financial damage alone was estimated at between $8 billion and $12 billion. But this is only a small part of the real consequences, as behind the visible figures lies a whole layer of problems that affected a wide variety of areas. Kevin Hassett, head of the National Economic Council, pointed out that the federal government shutdown cost the private sector approximately 60,000 jobs. Each week of downtime cost the economy approximately $15 billion. He estimates that GDP in the fourth quarter will be significantly below its potential level, by about 1.5 percentage points. National parks became a separate issue. They were either closed or operating on a strictly minimal service basis. This led to daily losses of millions of dollars that are usually generated by tourist traffic. People visited places such as Yosemite and other popular parks, but without staff supervision, they left trash behind, drew on surfaces, and behaved in ways they would not normally dare to do in the presence of rangers. Representatives of organizations responsible for the preservation of natural areas noted that it was extremely difficult to watch all this, because the damage was not being done to something abstract, but to real natural objects that needed protection. Small businesses near airports found themselves in a particularly difficult situation. Restaurants, small hotels, taxi services, and other companies whose work depends on a steady flow of passengers saw their revenues drop by about 60%. This was due to canceled flights and an overall decline in the number of people who could afford to travel during the shutdown. But the most painful consequence was not even the loss of income, but the gaps in economic statistics. The Bureau of Labor Statistics was unable to conduct its traditional surveys for the October employment report. As a result, data on unemployment, inflation, and other key indicators that the Federal Reserve typically relies on when making interest rate decisions were unavailable. Ultimately, the economy lost important benchmarks, and the lack of this information only exacerbated the already high level of uncertainty. While the financial losses were estimated in the billions of dollars, the social damage was measured in the lives of real people. Approximately 42 million Americans who receive SNAP benefits ended up without their November food payments. For a huge number of families, this meant that a routine trip to the store became a problem that could not be solved without outside help. Long lines began to form at food banks across the country. The number of requests for assistance increased approximately threefold, especially among families associated with military service. Many people who normally rely on SNAP simply did not have any savings to temporarily cover their food expenses on their own. This included seniors, single parents, people with disabilities, and those who were already living on the edge. The overall picture became even more complicated due to legal disputes. Federal courts required the Trump administration to first partially and then fully restore food stamp payments. The authorities tried to challenge these decisions all the way to the Supreme Court, hoping to block them. But in the end, this attempt was unsuccessful. The result was extremely uneven. In 19 states, people were able to receive their full November payments. In other regions, the population received only part of their benefits or nothing at all. Where a person lived practically determined how often the children in the family could eat normally, and whether they had to limit themselves to minimal meals, such as school breakfasts and dinners at home. Probably in no other area were the consequences of the shutdown as evident to ordinary people as in airports. Air traffic controllers and TSA security personnel were considered essential workers without whom aviation could not function, so they were required to report for duty even when their salaries stopped coming in. But at some point, it became clear that such tension could not be sustained indefinitely. When people did not receive their second and then third paychecks in a row, many began to take sick leave, look for temporary work, or simply stopped showing up for work. By early November, the staff shortage had become so severe that the normal functioning of the system was threatened. The Federal Civil Aviation Administration was forced to take measures that had previously seemed impossible. 40 of the country's largest airports reduced the number of flights by about 6%. On the busiest days, over 1,000 flights were canceled daily. Passengers stood in line for hours, and the airports themselves resembled huge waiting rooms where people had to literally live while they waited for at least some progress. Airlines were forced to adjust their schedules. United Airlines canceled about 135 flights in a single day, November 12th, when the shutdown ended. In the last week of the crisis, American Airlines removed about 200 flights from its schedule every day. Southwest was forced to revise its schedule without a clear understanding of when the situation would stabilize. Executives at major airlines acknowledged that such large-scale disruptions could only be compared to a few rare situations when the aviation industry faced serious disruptions in its operations. At the same time, the period before Thanksgiving, traditionally considered the busiest season for flights, was under real threat. Against this backdrop, Delta expressed greater optimism and assured passengers that the company would be able to restore its normal schedule by the coming weekend. However, experts observing the situation noted that even after the shutdown ended, its consequences could be felt for quite some time, delaying the process of returning to the usual rhythm. The psychological pressure on employees in all affected industries was no less severe than the financial difficulties. Many felt that they had been dragged into someone else's political conflict, even though they had no involvement in the decision-making process. People said that their work was aimed at serving society, but in the end, they found themselves involved in a political confrontation, as if they were bargaining chips. At the same time, the Trump administration tried to cut about 4,000 employees who were on probation, using the shutdown as an opportunity to reduce staff. However, a federal judge in San Francisco halted the process, temporarily blocking the layoffs and ruling the approach unlawful. When the shutdown finally ended, the law that was passed required the government to pay employees all back wages retroactively. But restoring the lost sense of stability and confidence in their own future will be much more difficult. Restoring trust and normal morale in the civil service will take much longer than simply returning money to accounts. When the political standoff finally ended, it was time to figure out who had won and who had lost. At first glance, it might seem that the Republicans achieved the result they wanted. The government resumed work, and the extension of Obamacare subsidies was not included in the agreement. In the end, the Democrats only got a promise that the issue would be put to a vote in December, and many critics considered this an empty and overly soft agreement. However, if you look deeper, the picture turns out to be much more complicated. A Gallup poll conducted in November showed that the majority of Americans, about 58%, simply blamed the entire Congress for the shutdown without dividing responsibility between the parties. At the same time, the results of the local elections held on November 5th gave the Democrats notable successes in a number of key states, which added an interesting detail to the overall picture. Sharp divisions began within the Democratic Party itself. Some of its representatives openly stated that the chosen strategy was a failure and was more like a refusal to take a position even before the healthcare issue was discussed. Others demanded a change in Senate leadership, believing that the minority leader should have taken a tougher stance and supported the 8 Democrats who voted to end the shutdown, even if they were labeled as defectors. Republicans, in turn, also experienced internal conflicts. Representatives of the more hardline MAGA wing accused Speaker Mike Johnson of not taking a strong enough line. Conservative commentators said that the party leadership had succumbed to pressure at the last minute and had effectively yielded to the Democrats. Donald Trump tried to present the outcome of the whole story as his own victory and a signal that he had achieved his goals. But even within his own party, there were skeptical assessments. Some senators, who preferred not to reveal their names, hinted that the huge financial losses were too high a price to pay for reaffirming the obvious, that budget decisions should not be turned into a political game. In any crisis, there are people who simply do their jobs and those whose actions draw criticism. During this shutdown, ordinary federal employees found themselves on the front lines. They continued to work without pay. Air traffic controllers ensured flight safety, TSA employees screened passengers, and border guards performed their duties at the border. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem announced $10,000 bonuses for TSA employees who performed their duties during the shutdown. These payments were intended to compensate for the additional workload and risk they faced while working without regular pay. Among those who were criticized, House Speaker Mike Johnson was often named as the leader. During the shutdown, the House was effectively non-functional, which led to a drop in his approval rating among voters. Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer was also criticized. But from the other side, progressive members of the party reproached him for sticking too long to a strategy that ultimately failed to deliver results. 8 Democrats and 1 independent senator became unpredictable players, ultimately voting to end the shutdown. Among them were Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, John Tester of Montana, and others. Their votes ended the crisis, even though they faced criticism from within their own party. The shutdown is over, but many issues remain unresolved. Current federal government funding has only been extended until January 30th, 2026. This means that in 2.5 months, the country could once again be on the brink of a new crisis if Congress does not take action in advance. Obamacare subsidies will continue to be in effect only until December 31st. The Senate vote promised by the Democrats may take place in December, but its outcome is not clear. For the bill to pass, it will need the votes of Republicans, who are traditionally opposed to expanding government health programs, and therefore the outcome remains unpredictable. Congress is discussing a bill on automatic continuation of funding. The idea is to automatically extend government funding at the previous level if Congress fails to pass a new budget on time. A September poll showed that this measure has the support of the majority of Americans, about 76%. One version of the bill suggests that members of Congress and budget office staff should remain in Washington until a new budget is passed. Proponents explain that if politicians want to play political games, they should do so at work, not at home. The shutdown attracted attention outside the U.S. as well. Tourists and foreign observers noted that the government shutdown was an example of how political conflicts can directly affect ordinary people. Some noted that this situation demonstrated poor coordination within the system and created the impression that decisions were being made too slowly. The international media covered the shutdown as an indicator of the dysfunctionality of the American political system. European publications were particularly critical of the U.S., comparing it to parliamentary systems, where crises are more often resolved by elections or government reshuffles rather than by suspending the work of government agencies. The U.S.'s economic partners also expressed concern. The delay in the publication of key statistics on employment, inflation, and other indicators created problems for the central banks of other countries, which rely on U.S. economic information when making their own monetary policy decisions. The 43-day shutdown turned out to be not just a political crisis, but also a serious test of the functioning of American democratic institutions. For the first time in the country's history, political confrontation led to the suspension of critical government and social programs for such a long period. This raised a number of fundamental questions about the functioning of the American political system. To what extent is it acceptable for Congress to suspend government operations as a means of exerting political pressure? How reasonable is it to link the financing of core government functions to the resolution of contentious political issues? Before the shutdown, some political commentators viewed the possibility of a temporary government shutdown as a way to protest systemic problems. In practice, however, the consequences hit those who were not involved in political games, and it was they who experienced all the difficulties and disruptions in the work of government services. In addition, the shutdown revealed internal divisions in both parties. The Democrats were divided between pragmatists willing to compromise and party members insisting on principled positions. The Republicans faced a dilemma between supporting Trump's position and growing pressure from voters demanding effective government. Ultimately, this shutdown became a vivid example of the high cost of political principles. Democrats were willing to sacrifice the normal functioning of the government in order to preserve health subsidies for millions of Americans. Republicans viewed these subsidies as unjustified expenses and were prepared for a protracted battle. Both sides misjudged their strength and underestimated the determination of their opponents. As a result, virtually everyone suffered: federal employees, welfare recipients, travelers, tourists, small businesses, and the economy as a whole. The American political system demonstrated its resilience. Democratic institutions withstood the test, the courts protected citizens' rights to social assistance, and the media maintained transparency. At the same time, the crisis revealed the system's vulnerabilities, particularly its susceptibility to political extremism and unwillingness to compromise. The lesson of the 2025 shutdown is clear. There are no winners in political clashes when ordinary citizens suffer. Millions of people were left without food aid. More than 1.5 million federal employees worked without pay. Thousands of flights were canceled. Museums and national parks were closed. The price paid by society was too high for the political ambitions of individual parties. The coming months will show whether politicians have learned from this crisis or will repeat their previous mistakes. One thing remains unchanged. In a democratic society, the government must work in the interest of its citizens, not become a hostage to party politics.